In a previous tutorial we looked at some of the basic tools available within Endorphin. We've created a scene using a single behaviour, but in this tutorial we're going to take that further by creating a scene using multiple behaviours. We'll create a scene with a character leaping from a building and trying to grab onto a railing stretched across in front of him. We'll use multiple behaviours to do this and then constraints to get the character to grab onto the railing. We're going to assume some basic knowledge of the tools available within Endorphin for this tutorial, but you can always refer to the reference manual at any point if you need further help. So let's begin by opening a pre-prepared scene. So we'll go to the File menu, Open Scene, and navigate to the Tutorial 2 Using Multiple Behaviours directory, which is in your installation directory, and from there select Tutorial 2 Using Multiple Behaviours Begin. Now there's something to bear in mind whenever you're working in Endorphin, and that is that when you simulate a scene, the simulation is calculated forward in time, so that any motion on any given frame is dependent on the motion on the previous frame, and that on the motion on frames previous to it. So for example, if you were to create a run, a jump and a roll, going back and changing the run would affect the jump and therefore the roll. All of this means that you should always work with your animation from start to finish, signing off each section of it once you're happy with it before you move on. So let's look at our scene now, and we have our standard character standing on a large block which represents a building, and in front of him is this bar which represents a railing, and we want him to leap from the building and grab hold of the railing and swing. Let's simulate now just to see what we get without anything on the timeline. And the character just falls and flops under gravity, falls to the ground, as you'd expect. So let's return to frame 0. And the first thing we want to do is add a jump behaviour. So let's go to our character 01's timeline, right click in that timeline and select Create Behaviour Event. We'll move that up to begin at frame 0 and then stretch it out so that it finishes somewhere in the region of frame 71. Now these values I'm giving, you can use these if you wish to get the same behaviours I'm going to get, but feel free to experiment with these values, and obviously changing these values will give you different results. So now we want to change the default behaviour type from arms windmill to a jump and dive behaviour, because we want our character to jump from this block. So we'll move to its property view, the behaviour property view, and under the name field select jump and dive. And now if we simulate, we can see the character tries to leap from the building but just flips and lands on the floor. So there are a couple of things we want to change here. If we move in a little and run through this animation, you can see his feet are slipping on that block, and also the strength of his jump, the distance he jumps, is not great enough to reach the bar. So the first thing we're going to change is the strength of that jump. So we'll select the jump and dive behaviour in the timeline, move up to its property view. You can see under its variables section there's a strength property, and that represents the strength in his legs. So we'll change that from 0.5 to 1, which should make him jump further. And now if we simulate, you can see that though he's not actually travelling much further, the jump is more powerful and he flips even more times before he lands. But he's not going any further because his feet are still slipping on this block surface. Now Endorphin has a notion of materials for its collision objects. So if I select this block and move up to its property view, you can see that it has a material field, and the setting there is currently default. If I click on default, you can see that there are various other material types I can select, and each of these material types has a set of properties associated with it. Some, for example, are more slippy than others, some are more grippy, some are more bouncy. The default material type is reasonably slippy, which is why our character's feet are slipping on that block. We want to change that to tarmac. And now if we simulate, I'll just pull back a little there, you can see that he has a lot more grip. The character leaps all the way across and actually hits the bar. But currently our character is just leaping in the direction he's facing. He's not really reaching for anything. He's not really reaching for the bar, which is what we want him to do. So we're going to use another behaviour to begin immediately after the jump and dive to make him look at and reach for this bar. So let's move down to the character's timeline and left click on the character name to select him, and this time we'll use the button in the main toolbar to create a behaviour for that character. Now let's drag that behaviour event down onto the same track as the jump and dive behaviour and make it begin at frame 71, just where the jump and dive behaviour ends. And then we'll drag it so that it ends at about frame 112. Now we can move to its property view, and in the name field from the drop down select hands reach and look at 2.0. Now there are a number of things we want to change about this behaviour, but the first thing we need to do is tell it what we want the character to reach for and to look at. So if we move to its property view, we can see that we have a property called look at target, which tells the character what we want it to look at. So if we click the word select in there, then move into the viewport and select the bar, you'll see it turns red to tell us it's selected. There's a similar property for the left hand target. Again, click select, and in the viewport select the bar, so this left hand will reach for that bar. And scrolling down we have another property for right hand target, and again click select and select the bar in the viewport. And now if we simulate, you can see that the character during the simulation looks up and reaches for that bar. If I play that, you can see that transition into the reach is actually quite snappy. His arms reach up pretty quickly. We want to make that reach just a little bit more leisurely. So to do that, again select the hands reach and look at behaviour and move over to its property view, and you can see that there's a property under left hand target called blend, and this represents the amount of time in seconds it takes for the arms to reach up, to blend into that action of reaching up for the bar. We're going to change that from 0 to 0.2, so it should now take his left hand 0.2 seconds to begin to reach for that bar. There's a similar property under right hand target, blend. We'll set that also to 0.2 and we'll simulate again. And you can see now that the reach is a bit more leisurely. So now we want to move around and zoom in a little so we can take a look at the point where his hands reach the bar. So somewhere there should be good. Now if we simulate, you can see by default the hands are reaching close to the centre of that bar. What we want to do is put a little bit of spread between those hands so that this hand reaches further in this direction and this hand reaches further in this direction. So to do that, we can select the hands reach and look at behaviour event again and move to its property view. If we scroll down under left hand target, there are various properties for offsets of that interception point, and we want the offset in X, which represents this direction here. If we change that value from 0 to 0.3, that means that the character's left hand will now reach 0.3 meters in the positive X direction, which is along here. So for the right hand target, we want the character's hand to reach in the negative X direction along here to spread it out a little. So we'll move down to the same property for the right hand and we'll change that to minus 0.3. Now if we run the simulation, you can see that the character reaches slightly wider than he did initially and makes contact with the bar. So at about this point we want the character to grab onto the bar and swing from it. To do that we're going to use a constraint. So let's go to the character's timeline and right click and select create constraint event. And let's make that constraint event begin at roughly this point, which is in fact frame 109. Let's stretch that all the way out to the end of the timeline. And then I'm going to alt right click in the timeline, which allows me to zoom and expand that timeline. This now allows me to drag this constraint event out to about frame 400. Now let's select the constraint event in the timeline and move to its property view, and under target objects we want to click select, and you can see that by default the character's pelvis is selected as a target for this constraint event. The constraint itself is of type lock, and what that will do is simply lock whatever is selected in space. And we want to select the hands as a target for this constraint. You may need to rotate and zoom to select the hands. And if you move out of selection mode as you're rotating or zooming, simply move back to the constraints property view and click select again. And then you can left click on one hand and then control left click on the other and right click anywhere in the viewport. Now if we move back to a position where we can see the animation. So now if we look at the simulation, you can see that the character jumps, grabs the bar and swings. But if we move in a little and take a closer look at his hands, you'll see that actually they're locked in space. And what we would like to see them do is to swing a bit more around this bar. This bar is laying along the x-axis. We can do that by selecting the constraint event in the timeline, going to its property view, and in the angular strength value change it to 0, and that will relax the constraint along the x-axis so that the hands are able to rotate. So now let's take a look at the simulation again, and this time you can see that the hands are much more relaxed in X and they actually swing and rotate a little with the rest of the character. So now let's move out again, and you can see that as the character grabs the bar and swings, he looks a little lifeless, a little ragdoll like. Now we want to add a bit more interest to that animation by getting him to kick his legs. We can do that with another behaviour event. So if we go to the character's timeline and right click, select create behaviour event, we can slide that along to begin at the end of the hands reach and look at behaviour, which is frame 112, and we'll extend it to finish at frame 400 along with a constraint. And now we'll change that behaviours type to legs kick 2.0 and simulate again. And you can see that now the character reaches for the bar, and as he grabs it and swings, his legs writhe about to give the animation a bit more realism. So you can see how it's possible to combine various different behaviours in sequence to get a realistic animation, and of course by changing the parameters and timings of these events you can end up with a huge variety of different motions.